to talk about something interesting.
Once again, thank you all for your support and continuing to find some value in this. I'd also like to thank you for contributing a number of really great comments that I wanted to highlight before we got into the episode. Anonymous YouTuber on YouTube questions if we can divine any meaning from the designs of the witches, or why I seem to skip over those. And yeah, really great question. It led me to thinking about it myself. Perhaps it's that they're so surreal, and that nothing about the witches themselves is really conveyed within the context of the TV show, but more in, the descriptions that they have in the games and things along those lines, the extended media. So trying to divine why Charlotte, for example, goes on about cheese without knowing her backstory is almost impossible inside of the show itself. Of course, that would be different for something like Octavia, though that really hasn't stopped us so far. So maybe there's some element of that, of diving into the witches' backstories. The other part that I'm really stumbling over is that they are so surreal. It's like trying to look at, any surrealist art and trying to divine this clear meaning from it when it's a whole genre like explicitly designed around confounding any easily discernible reading. It's like looking at the melting clocks in that famous Salvador Dali painting, or the elements that make up his face in that famous self-portrait painting, and being like, oh yeah, this is clearly because, he really liked elephants or what have you, or time melting symbolizes the time melting away, or something like that. It all like feels really stonery in a way that, I can guess be extended to all media criticism in general. But yeah, the inherent abstractness of it doesn't lend itself to these kinds of really poignant and focused looks, I suppose. Maybe that's just all to say that I'm really bad at navigating surrealist or abstract art, and if you guys have readings on the witches, I'd love to hear them. And that wasn't the only comment we had that questioned my biases in a really good way. Over on YouTube, Art brung up the idea that maybe Madoka will wish for Mami to come back to life. And this one I am genuinely ashamed for and sorry for. I really did feel like I messed up big time when I realized this, because it's something that I distinctly and passionately remember thinking the first time through when I think back on my first time through watching Madoka Magica. And I realize now that the reason I didn't even think about it, even though we kind of danced around it in a lot of the things that we said in the previous video, was that I have seen Madoka Magica so many times that I'm so far detached from that initial viewing experience that I didn't even consider bringing it up. But it's so integral to that mindset in the previous episode. So it's this really great example of how you can miss the forest through the trees, or how, I have my own perspectives, and it's only one of any number of infinite and valuable perspectives. And the only thing I can really offer you is my own special brand of the autism spectrum disorder and some 10,000 hours of watching TV shows made for little girls. So in that way, I'm kind of ashamed that I forgot this kind of crucial element of the episode that I claim to know so much about. Yes, it's almost deliberate in its absence here, right? We talked so much about Madoka's aversion to becoming a magical girl, or how the elements of the show have made Madoka into somebody who is averse to becoming a magical girl. So in that way, she's kind of forgiven for being the one who ignores the death of Mami in her wish making. In fact, it would almost be a betrayal of everything that Mami talked about in episode 2 and 3 about, the importance of knowing what you're going to wish for and wanting that and trusting in that. And that kind of compounds when Madoka learns about Homura's efforts to do so, or when Madoka gets further and further sent down the path of being averse to becoming a magical girl, because then there's so much invested in it. Then it becomes kind of this sunk cost fallacy that so many people have invested so much in making sure that I make the right wish, that it's a complete betrayal of everything that they've done to go back and make a wish for something as selfish as, well, not selfish, but yeah, kind of selfish, as resurrecting Mami. I think you can really see that in this episode in the scene with Homura when they talk about Mami. Now that said, Madoka is, again, the only person shown mourning Mami in that way. She's deliberately there alone with nobody else beside her at Mami's house. So then when we move to Sayaka, why does Sayaka not come to the conclusion that she should wish for the resurrection of Mami? Well, there's kind of a much more interesting and a much more simple answer there, I suppose. She doesn't care enough. That sounds bad. She doesn't mourn Mami in the way that would lead to thinking about resurrecting Mami. Again, everything we've talked about her onus to action, about her feeling the responsibility that she does, about her having other things that she wants to wish for. All the stuff still applies that we said about Sayaka's mindset of making her wish that she does, still applies in the context of forgetting Mami, or not forgetting Mami, but channeling Mami and becoming someone who can embody Mami. So the contrast there in why they don't resurrect Mami is that Madoka is fettered and probably aware and willing. However, Sayaka is unfettered, but perhaps a bit more resolved to do it her way. Finally, the third question is that if I thought of it when I was first watching it through, and then enough people commented on here to make that an obvious admission, that clearly the viewer thinks about why don't they resurrect Mami. And it may be a bit unsatisfying, but the way I want to address that is calling back to an earlier idea that what you're watching is not a plot show. It is not a Rubik's Cube or any type of puzzle where we're going to solve the correct solution. There is an element of that with Madoka's final wish in episode 12, but we'll talk more about that as kind of coda to the series and also manifestation of whatever Homura has done to make that happen. Madoka understanding Homura's endeavor. In that way, it's more of a manifestation of the feelings behind everything. To get back to why they don't resurrect Mami, we don't need to logically puzzle that out. Because if the characters were perfect logisticians, then they would, do all this kind of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality kind of bullshit of like, well, what constitute a wish? How many qualifiers can I put on a wish? Can I be tall and dark and handsome and resurrect Mami and have $1 million bajillion and cure cancer? The show would then become this thing of sitting down and fucking with the genie, which is just so not the space that we are operating in this endeavor, but also like divorced from the actual intangible emotions of a character-driven narrative. That, well, I mean, if we wanted to look at purely at the plot, I think there's better ways of going about it, which leads me perfectly into our next comment. I'd like to shout out a lot of support from the To the Stars Discord. If any of you are not familiar, the work To the Stars is a fanfic kind of sequel to Madoka Magica set in the same world, just with a very, very intense hard sci-fi bent to it. We're talking about like military strategies, we're talking about like resource allocation, we're talking about distinct power levels and science that is defined and codified. It's much more Isaac Asimov or Robert Heinlein than it is, say, Orson Scott Card. Heck, it kind of reminded me mostly of the Warhammer 40k/Sailor Moon fanfiction I read some ages ago. But if any of you are looking for that, want to know more about the actual systems behind everything and extrapolating the systems raised in Madoka Magica into what that could look like on a more grandiose scale, a more Legend of the Galactic Heroes type tale, then by all means check it out. And apologies if I misrepresented any of that. But on the Discord, a couple of the members brought up some great points, among them my assessment that I call episode 4 the weakest. Now, I don't want to recant here. I definitely think that's true. However, as they point out, it is a bridge episode. It is kind of episode 1 of Sayaka's arc. And yeah, as they point out, lays the groundwork for everything all the way up until episode 9. So perhaps the final judgment I would give for episode 4 going into episode 5 is that it's kind of hard to think about episode 4 or episode 5 or any of the episodes kind of segmented or divorced from the rest. We kind of talked about this in episode 3 of Madoka Magica, that Madoka Magica is crafted in a way that few other, if any other, franchises are, in that it has definitive beginning, middle, end, pacing, perfect, series composition, perfect, so that you get these beats, these really great moments, of which episode 4 doesn't really have any, or that they're lower or more subtle, but they're not meant to be consumed independently, right? This isn't, cheesy-ass Symphogear ending every episode on a big cliffhanger, and it's certainly not an episodic show where we can definitively, grade each episode of how well does it work as a little bubble. And I really do think you can see this more if you look at the remake movies. In some ways, Madoka Magica is a film. So talking about arbitrary stop and start points, even if you watched it episodically each week like I did, doesn't really have a whole lot of inherent purpose. It certainly does, but it doesn't ask to be viewed as individual episodic episodes, so let's not try and force it into that mold. And let's refrain from doing as I did and making value judgments on each episode going forward. He said, knowing full damn well he's going to break that promise very quickly. Now, in there, we just also mentioned that there are remake movies, which isn't surprising. There are plenty of those, even in the genre itself. But in the fact that there is another version of the tale of Puella Magi Madoka Magica. In the past, I've brought up the differences between the Blu-ray version and the original TV airing. And I will have plenty to say if we ever do make it to Rebellion about how the redaction of a lot of those things or the changing of the series with its popularity. So I guess it's good to mention that there is this kind of higher production value, second chance, really, that Madoka Magica was popular enough to be given that kind of treatment where they could go back and go through and kind of correct everything that they felt needed to be corrected, make it nicer, make it prettier, give it a new opening, and kind of reevaluate what was meaningful about it, make some value judgments retroactively. I think it's a bit outside of our scope for what we want to talk about here, but another kind of really obscure, fandom only thing that you might not be aware of, and I wasn't, is that there is a fan cut of Madoka Magica using the frames from the recap movies to recreate the TV series. That's pretty nuts and would take a large amount of work, so if you want to check it out, I'll put a link in the description below to the torrent. For my thoughts, though, I really love the jankiness of Shaft's original production, and the different concessions they made here and there when they weren't drowning in money from the success of Madoka Magica. Finally, the last comment I wanted to raise was Spence on YouTube brought up the possible reference of Sayaka descending down the elevator could be referencing Utena in the Black Rose Saga, or the parallel scene in Adolescence. And yeah, 1000% yes. And it's kind of one of the things that I will adamantly support that I, could be apocryphal, but I sure don't think so, would be that everybody has this background. No Magical Girl series comes out of nowhere. It's so iterative. The question isn't whether the creators of any Magical Girl work has seen Utena or has seen Cardcaptor Sakura or has seen Sailor Moon. Everybody has seen these. I once tried to put a picture of Sakura Kinomoto on my credit card, but then I called the credit card company and they said, you don't own this picture, and we know this to be true because we're big fans of Sakura Kinomoto and Cardcaptor Sakura, and you don't own this. And I said, well, snap. Can you just imagine being a Japanese girl growing up in the 90s or the 2000s? Or could you imagine being a creative who wants to know what good storytelling looks like, or wants to further understand the Magical Girl genre so they can write one or design one, and then get to that point without somehow not having been influenced by these titans of the genre? When Watanabe was looking for people to work on Space Dandy, he deliberately sought out people who hadn't seen Star Wars. And I guarantee you that would be much easier in Japan in that age range than finding somebody who hadn't seen Pretty Cure or something like that. The question then is, was this intended to be a direct reference? And that we'll never know unless we deliberately ask them to their face, which unfortunately isn't a luxury that we often have. To close out that thought, though, I will say that I pulled up a couple bits of Rebellion to use in the last show, and I started watching through the movie again, and boy, there are so many, whether it's intentional or not, so very many references to Princess Tutu. It's actually staggering, and we should definitely bring it up if we ever get to Rebellion. One final comment we had coming in was Mamí over on the Justice Discord commented that I will fight anyone who gets the wrong reading of Mami's actions in episode 10. And since I did mention that early on, it is something we kind of want to bring up, and I kind of want want to say that I'm a bit sorry for, because Mami actually provided a lot of evidence to support the fact that Mami's actions in the episode 10 timeline, where she shatters Kyoko's soul gem and binds Homura and is about to murder all of them to prevent them from becoming witches, is premeditated. And yeah, I kind of flippantly just commented that it's her losing her head, because I think in some ways it is. There's a lot of emotion behind her face there, and I think if she were thinking a little more critically, there's not a binary. Again, we see Mami and Homura both kind of fall into these binaries of, if all magical girls become witches, then we should kill magical girls before they become witches. That's not how it works, or that's not how you break a system, and that's not how you shatter things apart. So even if Mami does have the foresight to see this coming and plan out her actions, as this quote that Mami provided does display, then I think we can really see her actions in episode 10 as, again, her failing in the same way that she failed in episode 3. And I think it broaches this larger topic that is very much a magical girl topic of how, if you are presented an unwinnable situation, do you win? How do you create a miracle when you're told there's no way a miracle can exist? Those are the circumstances that we find ourselves in the climaxes of this show, but we'll save those for when they pop up later. To begin episode 5, we have a beginning not unlike we saw in episode 3 and in episode 4. Set once again in the hospital, however this time with a distinct red flare to the lighting, with the ominous droning in the background, and even later in the day than the previous episodes. And we have the same shot, of course, looking out at Kyosuke's window, and our friend the flower arrangement is back. I made a kind of a throwaway comment last episode that the flower arrangement could be interpreted as hope, and actually it fits very well here, that Sayaka is going to restore the hope that Kyosuke can be healed. And it matches kind of the flower petal symbology that we see on the roof. I don't know that flowers are an extended symbol past that, like they are in something like Utna. In fact, really the only place I remember them appearing again is in Homolily's design, plus a couple of rebellion scenes, or in the rose on the rosewood bow that Madoka and later Homura wield. And I think we're definitely short of any type of language of flowers, heart catch pretty cure type deal, because this is arrangement and there's other more general symbols for the flowers that come later, like take in the next shot. This is a shot with a lot of meaning behind it, which I think you can kind of tell because it feels so composed and so artificial. Like, look at the arrangement of this flower garden from the purpose of arranging a flower garden. It makes no sense. We touched on the abstract architecture of this world, but again, when it becomes so obvious that you have to pay attention to it, then it's decidedly being used as a symbol. You can't misinterpret that, right? The show's not being subtle here. It wants you to look for some meaning. I can remember kind of a similar tactic in a lot of Ikehara shows where he'll do something absurd or create some situation that doesn't exist in real life to kind of point out the absurdity of what's happening on screen and ask you to think about it on a metaphorical level. So then what do we have in this shot? Well, the first thing we're going to notice is, continuing on from the last shot, there's a very light wind coming in. Now, if you remember at the end of episode 4, we kind of associated the wind now moving to Homura and Kyoko from Sayaka after she makes her wish and comes in as a magical girl. And whatever that means, you know, whether it's the onus to action or just the causality waves going out. But right now it's kind of slowing down and settling on Sayaka making the wish here. She's not being blown anymore. It's coming to a head, whereas it'll eventually stop later that night in universe. So these sakura petals kind of are the first thing we're seeing here. We're settling down because this is the accumulation of everything that Sayaka's been building to since episode 1. We have the top-down perspective. It's pretty, integral if you've ever played Pokemon Snap, that the most important thing is the thing in the center of this picture. Right now that's Kyubey. This is only further heightened by the concentric circles. Concentric circles are a really great way of putting things geometrically or making them stand out. We talked a little bit about the crescent moon in the famous Sailor Moon pose, and it's so great because it kind of points your eye towards the center of the circle. Again, Kyubey, not Sayaka. Further emphasizing Kyubey is the line that goes off to the right of the screen. It's straight and bolder than the line that comes off Sayaka, as if it has a more imposing will or more power, and it even matches up with a few of the breaks in the flower garden in a way that is more pleasing or more in line with the world than Sayaka's does. does, which is kind of off-center and awkward and tramples over all the flowers. And then our basic directionality thing of, that we've been doing of Sayaka looking to the left and forwards. The left and the forwards is the light. The whiteness of the light source or the setting sun in this scene is to the left, the progress, the forwards, and then back and to the right is the shadow. However, the light source is gated off with no entrance by the shadow of the gate. And again, this is a scene with a lot of kind of vertical movement. We're not going to make progress running towards the left in this scene. It's kind of not that type of progress, right? It's that's where we want to go by the semiotics of what we've seen with the light in the shot, but this isn't going to necessarily get Sayaka closer, or as close as she might like. Finally, the only thing that I'd really say, mentioned Ikahara a bit already, but the lattice work, I guess you would call that, is that the right word? Lattice work on the gate is very reminiscent of stuff like Penguin Drum and Yurikuma. That kind of shadow appears all over the place, even in Utna. And I don't know, visual references like that are hard to call. It could just be a fancy gate, but there it is. One last thing about this shot before we move on is that we are straight top down. And this too kind of speaks to what we were talking about earlier about why we would start off these episodes with these Sayaka vignettes. Why isn't that it in full? Like why do we still have pretenses of Madoka or Homura being main characters in this show? Why haven't we focalized this show on Sayaka? Why is it still a vignette and we spent a lot of time with Madoka in the last episode? I think this again is another one of the really strong points of Madoka Magica, that it manages to juggle these things a little bit or have multiple characters acting in multiple ways and spend time with them. Many of the episodic magical girls, or even just bad anime in general, will really only follow the protagonist and really only show scenes directly related to their point of view. I want to hammer things home over the next couple episodes that everything that's going to happen to Sayaka is systemic. It's something that I mentioned before, but I think is really, really meaningful and really, really comes up a lot when we talk about what the intended takeaways are for this show. Okay, two quick references here. One, we've got to bring up Faust again. This scene is just a whole deal with the devil, Mephistopheles, making that bargain, right? And I would even venture to say that the concentric circles are the red aura in the background really gives it a hell feel. Well, I think a lot of that applies more towards Homura, with what we've just said about it being systemic, that I think it can apply to all the characters. Faust could be Sayaka or Homura or whatever. The point is everybody has their Gretchen. And two things about the contract process, which we're going to, view through Sayaka's lens. In a traditional Faustian bargain, the contractee must sacrifice their soul. We'll get to, I guess, what that means over the course of this, maybe in episode 6 where it becomes a little more meaningful. And then also this is done with a contractor who is recognized by the contractee as being evil or amoral. I think the lighting and atmosphere of this shot goes a long way in, kind of showing that. But if that wasn't enough, the second thing here is that Kyubey has these long tendrils coming off of it. We saw this a little bit earlier in episode 1 too, when it was first hinted at Kyubey watching the girls. But I think the main reference is the nine-tailed fox, which you may be familiar with from other anime or just cultural osmosis on the whole. They're sometimes called Kyubi or Kitsune, and they basically lie and trick people and steal people's souls. Ari from League of Legends is based off this same type of thing. The simple fact that the shadows don't match the lighting of what's on screen should call that out. And it's only really a short hop away to the pretty obvious reference, at least to a Japanese person. Sayaka's line, "Are you sure you can grant any wish?" Kyubey's response is, "Don't worry, I have power enough to grant yours." Pretty cool in a world building sense, I guess, of like, to have unlimited power, which we can break later with Madoka and the whole thing about, strings of fate and all that nonsense. And something that we can crack open the discussion of power dynamics, or, translating emotional power into magical girl battling power. I've heard it raised that the power of the magical girl is related to the power of their wish. And, maybe in a way it's correlated, but I don't think it's in the way that you're necessarily thinking of. A lot of people will criticize or tear down Sayaka by saying she made too trite a wish. We talked about, scope and pulling it out pretty far to attack more general evils or, break the system before, but I don't think that's directly correlated. I don't think that Sayaka making a wish finish that resolves with the redemption of only one issue or one tiny aspect of one character's problems has anything to do with her weakness as a character. Instead, I think it has everything to do with her hesitation, which we see in this exact scene. While she questions Kyubey, she still questions. She still doesn't trust. She doesn't feel. She doesn't truly believe. Believe in what she's doing. Believe in the path that she's taking. So much of her screen time has been wavering back and forth on deciding whether to take this action or not. And we'll see later that she needs the confirmation that her actions have had a positive benefit to be sure of herself. And when she loses that reassurance, then she's more easily or more ready to fall into despair because of it. No, Sayaka is a middling magical girl because she doesn't have faith. Or she doesn't have enough faith. Not in Kyubey, of course, in herself. In the values that she's fighting for. This, I think, is why Sayaka is positioned as much weaker than Kyoko in her fight later in the episode. And I love to point out that I talked a lot about this in the fight scene of Adolescence of Utena. So if you're interested in, the tipping point in making a combat that's tied to a character's motivations and says something about them as their value system is put on trial, then definitely go check that out. I'll leave a link below. With that said, and more to be said later, let's move on to the next shot, which features this crazy parallax scrolling. We see that the flowers aren't even an inch high either. The parallax moves the gate up towards the top of the screen and traps Sayaka in. And the parallax itself, very kind of disorienting or wobbly, I think very intentionally too. It's a disorienting moment for Sayaka. Oh, one final thing that I've meant to bring up for 4 episodes now that we never talked about is the bars. The aspect ratio is different in these pre-credit scenes. Why it is shot with a movie aspect ratio instead of the, normal 16:9 aspect ratio nowadays. Again, probably an element of disconnect, removing the viewer from the events of the show in sort of that same way as the curtain raising on the start of episode 1. Anyway, these next couple shots, the symbols, painting Kyubey in darkness, very, very clear, goes along very nicely with the light and the redness that we saw earlier. The shots continue to be disorienting with a lot of motion towards and away from the characters, a lot of warping. You don't see this very often in anime because it's notoriously hard to do. If you look at that Akira scene or anything in Redline or anything like that, moving the camera in towards the character is like you have to think about each frame and like draw each frame with the motion moving in and how large the characters are going to be. It's very difficult. And I think they get away with a lot of kind of really wonky and disorienting animation because it's a wonky and disorienting scene. And I don't really have a whole lot to say much else about the rest of this scene. Kyubey has some lines about this is your destiny, things like that, accept it, really in line with its philosophy. There's a brilliant tinted light blue shine on the soul gem that is really beautiful against the really harsh shadows of the background, and the very high contrast of the scene gives a great feel and a weight to it. And yeah, you've got this girl hitting very slowly, no weight to her body thing, kind of like Bakemonogatari episode 1. But I would doubt that it's a specific reference. And just the final shot of all the flower petals scattering into the sky. It's good for chaos, it's good to show that upheaval is happening, and it's good to show that Sayaka is losing control in this way. I mean, compare Madoka's wish to Sayaka's. And even just on the graphic level, we can see that they're completely different, purely in terms of agency and ownership. I think what's really cool after seeing this is that it comes before the end of last episode, or even before midway through last episode, right? The incongruency in the timeline here is used for effect for the reveal at the end of episode 4, obviously, but it also gives them some credit to go back and flesh it out, and then cut forward to the next day, and we're going to stay with Sayaka through the next 2 scenes, and really give her all the time she needs to justify herself, her decision, why she's doing it, to Madoka, and to herself, really, to position her feelings and her thoughts and her values so that when they're challenged by Kyoko at the end of the episode, it's going to feel like something worth fighting for. Because we've seen Sayaka's happiness, elation at having her wish fulfilled, because we've seen her try and answer to Mami's values in this next scene, we're going to be behind her in that way. So we're going to understand why she wants to fight for those, even at the cost of her life. Imagine a much worse version of Madoka Magica where they just cut to the Kyoko Kyoko or Madoka and Homura scenes after this, and didn't give Sayaka time to flesh out her wish and breathe and enter in this space of the magical girl, it would be really, really tough to take, or really hard to get behind her for the next couple episodes. I guess that's just to say, for a show that has all these, memeable moments and highlights, that most of the show is made in these kind of downtime moments and pacing moments. Okay, we've got some really good stuff here. If you want to make things look normal, then do the things that you've done previously that you've associated with normal. So this shot of the top of the school, and then inside the classroom looking out at the students, stuff we've all seen in previous episodes. In this normalcy, Hitomi yawns. Since it came after the intro, I don't know that this is a direct response to Sayaka's intro wish, but I think it's more in response to the normal, everyday boringness that's being established here. There's nothing exciting going on for Hitomi, even while Sayaka's world is completely changing. It's the main idea of this scene that nobody knows but Sayaka and Madoka. Look at how smug Sayaka is and how well the voice actresses deliver the line of, "Really? What happened?" All innocent. She enjoys playing the hero again, but she doesn't actually care about Hitomi. We never see her go comfort her friend who was in this life-threatening situation after she's helped her with it. And that's like such a huge missing scene. And we feel the continuing contrast between Sayaka and Madoka's outlooks. Just two really quick shots of their differing responses is all we need to understand where their headspace is and lead us very naturally into the next scene. We've got some nice piano chords as the setting is set. Very awkwardly again, we have the windmills with oil refinery or some sort of mechanical background there. The windmills are kind of the calling card of this scene, and they go very much along with the idea that Sayaka, in making her wish, has blown the wind outwards, like we saw last episode, that her coming in has blown wind onto Kyoko and to Homura. Now these windmills are again a symbol of that, of this effect, this ripple effect going outward and kind of shock waves out from Sayaka's decision. But as for the mechanical stuff, I'm not really seeing that. I guess we could correlate it to the train tracks where, Sayaka's ultimate fate happens. But right now, I don't have a reading for that. I'll tell you what I do have a reading for, and that's absolutely Sayaka reaching up towards the sky and stretching her arms while laying on the grass. That's very natural and very clear that the sky we've already identified in episode 2 and 3 of being this kind of endless potential, this wide open world out there that these girls can go, and she's grasping at it right now. And her stretching is an attempt, making an effort to grasp it, and it's a happy thing, right? That all of this put together shows you her mental state going into being a magical girl, and her dialogue later in the scene really explicates that, but it's good to see it visually first. She says she's scared of losing Madoka and Hitomi, but we didn't see that interactions. So either she's very good at hiding it, which, yeah, she's very good at suppressing her feelings, like obviously we see that later on, or she does have this true trait of heroism where even if she's scared, she puts on a brave face and goes forward anyway. She says she's confident and she's at ease. And why is that? Because she made her value judgment. That was the wish. And something we talked about with Mami and her regret for not making that, or not thinking it through, or not being able to think it through, was that the wish needs to be something you can believe in, something you can put all your weight behind. In this moment, Sayaka is feeling that. She is resolved that her wish was the correct thing to do. If Sayaka holds on to this mindset throughout the rest of everything that happens, she will not turn into a witch. All she needs to do is believe this with all her heart and hold on to it. It's like the Nietzsche quote, right? He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. We'll not see Sayaka lose her why to live, just have it challenged, and the hows eat away at it to the point where we don't even really believe that she believed it in the first place, even though we see it in this scene. One other thing I'll point out in this riverbank scene is that Sayaka doesn't ever really reach that sky, and I think it's really evident here with the shot of her head and the windmills that she's straining there, but in this classic thing that Madoka Magica likes to do, or Shinbo likes to do in Madoka Magica here, is really go with the contrast, the brightness of the shot, and use that to kind of say something about it. Here, we're seeing Sayaka constantly reach up to the sky, put herself, try and embrace that potential, right? But then the shot shots kind of really place her on the ground. Even though it's this nice green riverbank, it's still grounding her. And the one shot where she does try and get there, where she does like kind of claim that sky, she gets the dark overtone. It happens again when the shot is reversed and we see it towards the riverbank. Of course, the other thing about this scene is Madoka mentions the regrets, and then two things very clearly indicating Mami flash up on screen. And Sayaka says, I regret that I waited this long. So, yeah, telling you, without telling you all the stuff we saw in episode 4, that Madoka is reeling because of the loss of Mami. Sayaka, we haven't seen take that loss in the same way and have this alternative path that she's going to forge for herself. But it's not to say she's put Mami 6 feet under, never to be thought about again. Instead, she contextualizes Mami's death as I was an idiot for my indecision. This may look like the same thing, right? They're both lamenting Mami's loss, but it's not. Madoka is the one actually lamenting Mami not being there anymore, or the non-existence of Mami. Sayaka is lamenting the choices that led up to that, and contextualizing it with blaming herself. Again, yeah, Sayaka, very pragmatic, actually, very, thinking about the actual causes and effects and everything. But this, again, is a magical girl show. It is not a show where thinking logically is going to help you do anything whatsoever. Actually, you know what? That's a bit unfair. I want to say that thinking logically has its place and will definitely be a contributing factor in overcoming the obstacles that are placed in the way of the magical girl. However, that's usually in the context of a team or in the context of the greater good of the emotional weight behind everything. It's only one part of the whole. Right here and alone, it's not going to do much. I mean, I guess other than, understand Kyubey, which I don't know how much that helps anybody. I mean, again, if you're going to empower emotions, like literally empower emotions with your plot of the show, you better have some dang good emotions. I think the final thing I'll say about the riverbank scene is the element of serenity, of the still waters that the shots cut to, the heavy blue symbology, everything that goes along with what we were, talking about with Sayaka's character design, or what we will talk about later on, and how the still waters contrast with what we see in the Sayaka and Kyoko fight at the end of the episode. And this scene is, of course, Sayaka's triumph. We've got the flower back, we've got the hope back, nice. And the lighting in this scene, it's been something that's come up again and again in these shot compositions, but wow. I don't feel as if we've given enough time or attention to the lighting in this show, because it is something very prominent, and it is just one of those really simple, really effective ways of directing a shot that completely transforms the meaning of whatever you're saying. And there's a lot of interpretations. While we always have the light as some sort of positivity, as just a general human symbol, the framing on a shot like this could be interpreted so many different ways, of Sayaka putting Kyosuke in a box, or that there's darkness all surrounding the two, that they're steeped in it, that things are very hard and fast, that there's distinct periods of shadow and distinct periods of light, that it's very binary in its lighting. And all of this is kind of subliminal, and all of it's kind of tonal, and it's really hard to, say one way or the other, but I think it really does extend throughout this entire scene and match with a lot of the previous scenes that we saw in this same situation. All the way up until this final shot here of Sayaka alone on the roof, surrounded by the setting sun and clouds, kind of encapsulating everything about that lighting, how the setting sun's been used already, and how the silhouettes and blackness has been used. And what's more, it was changed in the Blu-ray version to even be starker and harder on the blacks. So it's just evidence that there's meaning behind it. Heck, in the recap movies, they throw the fence up there. And yeah, I think the changed versions are a little bit more visually distinct. So again, we've got the symbols of, rising in an elevator this time, and this triumph scene happening right where Sayaka contracted with Kyubey. And I think that gives it a sense of scope of being very much tied into this one little world, this one little problem, this one little character's little emotional play that she's putting on. Evening, exterior, roof of the hospital once again. Just another drop in the bucket of all those things about diegesis and of Madoka breaking the cycle by expanding expanding her view. Let's also consider that Kyosuke plays probably one of the most famous songs in the entire world, Ave Maria. There's far, far too much baggage or potential references in Ave Maria to go through. I mean, we could talk like Bride of Frankenstein when this piece soothes Frankenstein's creature on a violin. But let's take a moment to look at the lyrics. Although based on an English work, it was the German translation that was first set to music, so we don't really often understand it, again, unless we speak German, much like the Faust quotes earlier. And of course, nobody sings it here, it's played on the violin. But here, I don't think you've ever heard this, or I know I hadn't before I looked it up. This is the lyrics to Ave Maria. It's a hymn to the Virgin by Sir Walter Scott, and it goes, Ave Maria, maiden mild, listen to a maiden's prayer. Thou canst hear through from the wild. Thou canst save amid despair. Safe life may we sleep beneath thy care, though banished, outcast, and reviled. Maiden, hear a maiden's prayer. And of course, the association of this song with Christianity is something that we can mirror in Kyoko and her backstory with her father. And the literal translation being of a virgin girl praying to the Virgin Mary for protection amidst despair. You realize that it's the best song that they could have chosen in this instance, and that's fantastic. Especially when she calls out to Mami. Once again with a focalization on Sayaka. I don't think we've heard anybody else's internal monologue over the course of the show. But much like episode 4's opening, this scene breaking the storytelling conventions of the point of view still reinforces everything that we talked about back then. So I definitely say we have to have this moment, right? This is the moment that Sayaka clings to desperately when everything else goes awry. This moment needs to be what she believes in when everything else is challenged. This needs to be motivation enough for her to go on living her life. It seems here that she's able to reconcile Mami dying and her not wishing her back to life, and everything that she's going to have to do as a magical girl. It seems that she's got it all together. But of course, we know she's told us that it's all going to fall apart. So what's really to the show's credit is that it wastes no time doing that. Now, for a show that is so highly focalized around Sayaka at this moment, really setting her up as the primary driving force of the show right now, the show does another kind of play-y thing in set up this scene of Kyoko and Kyubei. So I guess my question is why? We don't particularly need Kyoko's whole back scene to understand Sayaka's story, but we do it to manage the viewer's expectations, to direct mental energy towards what's going on with Homura, what's Kyoko's objective, to really remove us from this emotional triumph of Sayaka and place us back in the mindset of, oh wait, she's still in this world that is going to have no allowances for this type of happiness. Just like her, we don't get to enjoy her happiness for very long at all. And that's not very Cash money. And it comes right before the break, too. She's not even allowed to have her one moment of serenity before it gets interrupted and put on the back burner and sidelined to the plot of the show. The other meaningful thing about this scene is that we get to see Kyoko at the start of Madoka Magica. Her attitudes to what's presented, the unknown information about the other magical girl, is carefree, or she'll handle it when it comes. That's not something that bothers her. So that shows a confidence, that shows a disregard for planning, and all of this kind of seems very natural to stem from her backstory. And also that she's going to pick a fight, or that she's going to engage Sayaka, and there's going to be some conflict here. Now, while Kyoko is definitely chaotic in that way, she's not evil, and when she approaches Sayaka later in the episode, it's absolutely apparent that she's willing to talk things out, and in the other timelines, we see her work with the other girls, and in a different story, we see her work with Mami. So the real impression here is that Kyoko is a loner. This makes it easier to understand when she kind of cares about these values after engaging with Sayaka and everything in episode 9 happens. It's not that she actively opposes the values that Mami stood for or that Sayaka says she embodies. It's just that she's lived without them for so long that she's learned to adapt, or her truth has become something other than that. Another note about the shot composition in this observation deck here, one obviously completely completely unrealistic. There's no way to get up or down. It's something we saw earlier with the Windmills too. That nothing makes sense in the city, and it doesn't have to. It's all a fabrication anyway, and don't pay attention to it. But also that Kyubey is constantly in the center of all these shots. The show is literally revolving around Kyubey. And a last thought before we move on. Kyoko's dialogue translation and voice acting is really top notch here. Usually with these kind of quirky or, low diction characters, the localization will get really weird. Think like the Osaka dialect in Card Captors or Magical Doremi.
I've had it with him insulting Candy. He just thinks girls can never be as strong as boys.
There's a lot of hooey, and we're gonna help you prove it to him, kid.
Of course, this is a much later and more refined process. They really nail kind of that carefree, uneducated attitude. And her voice actress in English, Lauren Landa, does a great job by dropping the voice lower than it would normally be in the Japanese equivalent.
はぁ？どういうことさ？そいつだってあんたと契約して魔法少女になったんでしょ？
Huh? You gotta be kidding. If she's a magical girl, then she'd had to have made a contract with you, right?
Again, the sweet and stylish background transition out of the scene and into the cafeteria in the mall. I love this establishing shot here. Madoka has some fries with a burger and some orange soda. Homer has a black coffee. It's like that continuum, the spectrum of going through McDonald's drive-thru, and Madoka's like, McDonald's, and Homer orders one black coffee and drives away. So a couple of really cool character interactions happen in this shot. First, Madoka trusts Homura. We've seen that already, right? But also that Madoka knows that there is some potential that they could all work together, or that her classic ideals of the magical girl genre, and whether it's disregard or ignorance or marginalization of the logical acts that have been established in front of her, that put this show on a path different from that, she still wants to establish that, or she still knows that nobody has honestly given it a good try to do that, or with talking about our problems in this kind of Princess Tutu way, we can avoid this heartbreak, or we can come to a better situation than we have prior. And yeah, through the benefit of episode 10, we know Homer rallies against that for her reasons. But honestly, that doesn't make her wrong. And by her, I mean Madoka and Homura. And yeah, let's save that for later in the show. What happens here is that Madoka voices her support of Sayaka's endeavor and values as a magical girl, just as she supported Mami, and just as Homura made the comment about being envious about it, and then Madoka opened her heart to Homura as well, Madoka is now putting her weight behind Sayaka, and that comes into fruition later when she's about to make the wish to save Sayaka. Homura is upset because she's seen this happen again and again, and of course Madoka's gonna do it till the end of time. It's the whole, if anyone tells you it's wrong to hope. Given any chance whatsoever, Madoka is going to attempt to embody compassion and understanding and love for the other girls. Homura, of course, in this timeline is bent on stopping that. And to her credit, this isn't, a biased thing. She simply assesses Sayaka's strengths. Simply assesses Sayaka's strengths. And also her weaknesses. But are any of those out of the ordinary? Are any of those so irredeemable? No, of course not. Sayaka's a wonderful character, a real human being, and honestly does have a real solid heart to get behind. And it's easy to see why you would want to support Sayaka. Re the whole Madoka supporting everyone thing. I'm reminded of this quote. It's that love isn't a perfect state of caring. It's an active noun like struggle. To love someone is to strive to accept that person exactly the way they are, right there and right now. And that's from Fred Rogers, who very clearly understands magical girl values. And once again, Urabuchi pulls the reflective writing with Homura, and in this way that kind of inspires all this mystery, especially after Kyubey just said, I have no idea what's going on with her. And I think it feels so reflective. I think it feels like, why is Homura talking about this in such a pulled out viewpoint? She's speaking so generally that it feels like it has to apply to something other than Sayaka. So you put those two things together, and then you kind of get this idea that she's referring to herself or her issues or whatever we haven't been told about her yet. And I think this too is really clear on your first time through. That this is so awkward of a thing to even say on that first diegetic level that it makes you recoil like Madoka does and think about things and be like, what? And of course, she ends her diatribe on that's the reason why Mami Tomoe lost her life before popping the lid on her coffee. Again, very easily read even on your first time through. I would bet that if you asked just about 90% of people watching this through the first time, they would connect that head popping off to Mami's head popping off. And they would obviously, if they're paying attention, know that that's a rude as fuck thing to say. Not only because the character is so recently demised, but also because none of that adds up, or none of that's true by the logistics of magical girls. Homura brought it on that level. She was the one that suggested those are fatal flaws for magical girls, but I've got thousands of hours of background that says, wait, no, actually, that's the main thing of magical girls. So maybe we're back at the idea that to truly be a magical girl is to truly suffer, that all magical girls must sacrifice, and that ultimate compassion is ultimately giving everything that you have. Still, the way she phrases it, the way she connects it back to Mami after bringing it out so far, is so abrupt and aggressive that the viewer is intended to think of Homura as wrong here. So anyway, Madoka's next line brings up the problem. If somebody like Mami is unable to win, and she having such values was not invincible, then what is the metric by which the magical girls are rated on their power scale? Because Sayaka sure as shit doesn't have the amount of power of a Mami, and even in the best case, if Homura is lying here, and traditional magical girls values apply, then Sayaka is still only ever going to be as good as Mami, and again, Mami died. So she's appealing to the one magical girl who she knows has some type of strength, whether that is emotional willpower or values or just something else. Homura really shuts Madoka down hard here, and that makes the payoff in everything that happens with their relationship later in the show so much more valuable. In episode 12, when Madoka says, "I see it all, Homura, I know everything that you went through for me," and knows how much this must hurt Homura. Oof. Also in this conversation, Homura mentions that she should not have allowed Sayaka to make that contract. And remember in the timeline when this happened, it was in that parallel scene when Homura was walking back with Madoka. It's kind of the first time that we see her fail. She's not omnipotent. And it could also probably be said that her caring more for Madoka than Sayaka allowed this eventuality to happen because they were in two different places. Obviously, Homura was probably scared about Madoka becoming a magical girl to wish Mami back. Homura's dialogue intensifies all the way to the point of these very quick, off-kilter shots back to back, and she drops the bomb of comparing magical girls to zombies, or dead already. That's likely in relation to her knowledge of them turning into witches eventually. It seems like that single element really broke Homura. So when Madoka asks, "Have you given up all hope entirely?" then yeah, of course Homura has. She's given up all hope of magical girls existing without turning into witches, something that she right now sees as ultimate. However, she hasn't given up hope, as she says here, for all other magical girls. She hasn't given up hope on her wish, obviously, or else we'd see Homu Lily right now. So then we either have Homura lying or misinterpreting Madoka's words at the end of this scene. I generally think that testing a character by making them do the exact opposite of what they want is a pretty cool and interesting character dynamic or plot dynamic. Seeing Homura push Madoka away so harshly, well, it builds up all this unspent energy, everything pushing us towards Madoka's reading of the situation, that she would want to reconcile, that she would want to come together with Homura, understand Homura, have Homura understand her point of view, share in Homura's burden and her pain. And I think that feeling being passed on to the viewer is really one of the large successes of Madoka and makes it such an emotional push towards that catharsis. In the next scene, we have the chairs. Damn, we forgot the chairs in the hospital. Let's go back to the hospital. We gotta talk about these damn chairs. The chairs appear after Sayaka has made a wish for another person. Chairs, again, pretty clear symbol, as we talked about in episode 1, for the other magical girls that have come before. Putting the chairs in Kyosuke's room when Sayaka is having this kind of moment of seeing her wish fulfilled is really critical to saying other magical girls have come before. Other magical girls have seen this exact scene play out before, which is key, again, for establishing this as systemic and positioning everything as needing to be solved on a larger scale. So when the chairs appear here again in Sayaka's room, being nervous on the first day of going out hunting witches, or more generally, not knowing if she's up to the task of being a magical girl is something again that thousands of magical girls have shared. And I could list a million of them. But there you have it. And here now, after voicing her support for Sayaka to Homura, she voices her support for Sayaka to Sayaka. After hearing her confession on the riverbank, Madoka now supports her. And that's important to come immediately after Sayaka has just been shown to have nobody else that supports her. And we have this very basic directing trick. When you're talking about something that is a facade or not integral to the character, then you pull out far. When Sayaka says, I am going to hunt wicked witches because I'm an ally of justice. But then when she's saying later that her hands are shaking, it pulls in so tight. And then Kyubey having its sights set on Madoka. You should definitely go watch that. I think it's a Digibro video where he talks all about Shinbo and the fucking zooming in on the eyes. It's like a whole thing. I'll try and put it down below in the show notes. And again, these shots of going out and finding witches, making it seem kind of tedious, but also that idea that they're not really making any progress. They're not moving across the screen, merely moving on the screen in place. Alright, this next bit I've already titled Madoka Magica Episode 5, Part Character Design. I think it's worthwhile to talk about Kyoko and Sayaka together. And I think there's more than one reason for that. The first really good look we get to see at Sayaka with her transformation sequence is the same time we get to see her battle Kyoko. There's one of these concepts of the red Oni and the blue Oni, two kind of demons that oppose each other and have different kind of values, and you see it again and again and again all over the place in Japanese media because it's a very well-established trope, with the red Oni being wanton and free and impulsive, and the blue one being the opposite of reserved and in control a bit more. This, however, is just a general grounding, and I think the show goes far to point out how Kyoko and Sayaka foil each other even in their character design. But then a large part of their arc is going to be how they're so very similar in so many regards. Certainly an odd couple vibe. So let's start off with Sayaka because we know her more than we know Kyoko at this point. Her weapon of choice is a sword. I shouldn't need to tell you that magical girls don't wield a sword for a reason. We mentioned it with Mami, but here it's manifested in a way that can't be ignored or glanced over. A sword is a weapon that can only cut down others. It cannot build them up or help. The only will it can manifest is pain. This is why no magical girl ever uses a sword, and why magical girls in fact have canonically, in a number of places, even something as recent as Hugto Precure or as old as the last episode of Sailor Moon, have literally rejected the use of a sword. And before you say, oh, what about Revolutionary Girl Utena? Utena has a sword throughout the entire show. Well, I think Revolutionary Girl Utena makes their sword very clearly an object of service and not of empowerment or healing. And I would very much encourage you to go back and check the symbols of what a sword is and what a sword does in that show. Or you could just watch my Adolescence breakdown where I talk about the symbol of masculinity in a prince's sword. One other thing to note about Sayaka's sword is that it's a cutlass. Straight from the Wikipedia page of this type of sword, we learned that it was a sailor's weapon. Its popularity was likely because it was not only robust enough to hack through ropes, canvas, and wood, but short enough to use in close quarters, such as boarding. Another advantage of the cutlass was its simplicity of use, once again marking Sayaka as a novice, and then also setting up the nautical themes that we'll see later with Octavia, or even inner transformation with the water themes. So we've got two ideas here. One is that she's fundamentally misunderstanding what a magical girl needs to be, as she's manifesting a bunch of swords. I would also kind of tie this in with the cape she wears around her neck. As The Incredibles taught us, real heroes don't wear capes, because capes are ridiculously impractical for any type of combat. What a cape would be useful for is somebody who wants to dress up playing like they're a hero. So then consider that also she's failing at being a hero. Or perhaps not failing yet, but having the affectations of being one without actually having the background in one. She's playing at being a hero. She has a sailor's sword, not a prince's, not a noble's, not a warrior's. She wears the trappings of what a hero would appear to be. But just like we already already saw with the value system in last episode when she didn't go comfort the people who were hurt by the witch, she's already betraying the values. Just like we saw earlier in episode 2 and 3 that she rejects Homura out of hand like Mami did. She doesn't have the values of the magical girl. She's bluster. She's affront. She's putting on airs because that's who she thinks she wants to be, and just becoming that or having the qualities that would, in her mind, identify a person as that, as a hero, as a champion of justice, is what she manifests with. And the facade here, or how superficial that all is what a lot of Kyoko calls out this episode, or why she's not as powerful as Kyoko. Because, and this is something we brought up before, that the actual physical power of whatever these people have in universe is only directly tied to their emotional state, to their character willpower, to these ephemeral and non-specific values that they hold. And that's how it's always been, right? That's why a sword doesn't work. A sword's power and effectiveness is based on your speed and strength and skill with it. A magical girl's effectiveness is based on the belief or the hope that that character inspires, the power that they grant to the other people by believing in them, by their resolution in the values that they hold dear. So when characters in a magical girl show will fight or conflict, then the character with purity of purpose will come out ahead. And two, it ties back into the values that Madoka has been imparted with, and how sure she is about the value of other people's lives, about supporting other people's way of engaging with life and giving life meaning. And it ties back into everything we talked about in the first episode in the magical girl family. This is a bit of an aside, but I had to speak with it because I was watching a bit of Magical Do-Re-Mi this past couple weeks, and then I interacted with a bit of Hugto Pretty Cure again. And those two seasons of Magical Do-Re-Mi and then of Hugto Pretty Cure both share this idea of raising a younger generation of magical girl. And of course, extend this to any Chibiusa or Vivio Takamachi or, anybody you want to pull in here because it occurs again and again, but that there is a value to the magical girl being raised in this way and learning these values from a very strong and healthy nuclear family. Then there's an incredible amount of value of a magical girl being a mother, and kind of the second generation of magical girl, like a magical girl raised, steeped in pure magical girl values, being immensely powerful, or beyond even the scale that we can conceive, far outstripping her mother. And why is that? It's because there's no room for doubt in those values. If your mom saved the world through compassion and understanding, it's only on you to accept that that's the truth, not to go out and prove it again. In this way, Madoka is kind of a second-generation magical girl. Introdiegetically, of course, we made reference to Junko as magical girl in episode 1, but I'm more talking about genre database awareness here, that Madoka is the product of everything that these magical girls produced in this first run of the magical warrior genre. What's more, if we think about it in the context of the story, Madoka version 1 that Homura first encountered is probably a canonical magical girl who came from this nice family and in your vein of a Nanoha. And she and Mami raised Homura in sort of a way of, adopting somebody that didn't have a family or anybody to rely on. And then Homura reset time, came back, and now she is influencing Madoka, right? She's negatively influencing Madoka. She's telling her actively, and in this episode, that these values don't add up to things. They don't create this happiness. But in some weird way, she's again priming Madoka, or raising Madoka like Madoka raised her. It's an inversion, yes, it's a little bit awkward, but I think it's still kind of along this metric. This is a really compelling idea, and we want to hold on to this when there are more combat scenes in the show. And the general idea of associated power levels to willpower or ethics or value systems is really integral for what we see with Kyoko and Sayaka over the course of the next couple episodes. We've already established that both Kyoko and Sayaka are deliberately divorced from this type of strength. Not only are they victims of this system, but they're also victims of a cruel world that didn't give them a family to grow up in and learn these values from before becoming magical girls. So in this way, they're kind of 2 steps divorced from wherever Madoka is going to end up. To talk further about this, I want to reference a post called Color Symbolism in Madoka Magica. I'll put a link in the comments. It's by user This Shit Is Dope on the True Anime board on Reddit. And it's a fantastic essay, and I really, really do love the way they've structured and support their arguments here. Because it's an interpretation that I hadn't considered, but also really does provide an element of backing in the character design to the values that we've already been talking about over the course of these past couple episodes, and so right here as well. Remember in episode 3 and in episode 4 when we were talking generally about Madoka backing the other magical girls, that she is supporting them, she's buying into Mami's view on the world and legitimizing it, and so empowering it in doing so. But if we consider the other girls that kind of vie for Madoka's support in this show, Sayaka and Kyoko, and of course Homura, then those are these primary colors of yellow, blue, and red that vie for this attention here. That they have different meanings, that the yellow is that compassion that Mami showed, or those values, that red is the things that we already talked about with being aggressive and changing the things that you want to see changed, and blue is the honor and the upholding, the heroism. Then the white of Ultimate Madoka is a manifestation additively of all those colors combining and mixing. And throughout the show, we're going to see Madoka support Sayaka. We already saw her support Mami. We're going to see her support Kyoko in those desires. And then Ultimate Madoka, we are going to see her do that for all colors. And that's kind of why the Ultimate Madoka is drawn in this white kind of uniform. They also make a number of connections here that are very, very clear and obvious to previous magical girl shows regarding Ultimate Madokami, your hard-catch pre-cured giant goddess of whatever. And throughout so many magical girl shows, the more power-ups they get, the whiter they get. And in some ways it's purity, in some ways it's cleanliness, a focusing of the values. But I really like the interpretation from This Shit Is Dope to pull it into adding in all the colors together. And of course the reflection of Homura as kind of a negative of it. But I think where I would disagree with This Shit Is Dope in their color interpretation is that Homura is a purple, or that yes, she has a black and gray and white themes too, so there's a lot in there to break down in regards to Homura that we could talk about. But I would say that purple is just another color, another interpretation, another way of looking at the world that Madokami will ultimately support. And the true black of Homusufer is something that we'd have to save for Rebellion sometime. To finish up this color theory talk, and again, please go read this essay, it's very great, is that they mentioned the pink of Madoka and the symbol of rose that blossoms off her rosewood bow. That pink is definitely a tie back to normative magical girls. It's something we definitely went over in episode 1 and is totally true. But then there's this element of blooming that again and again, these tipping points where Madoka is denied the ability to become a magical girl and make her wish and manifest her will upon the world. The pink is the symbol of that. Or the rose blooming is the symbol of that. If we think about it in this color theory, then it's a segment of this yellow popping up and then being cut down, and then this blue popping up and being cut down, and this red being cut up and cut down, and then this purple being behind it all and, looking. But then this pink never blossoming, this pink never manifesting, and then skipping right towards the white instead. So thank you, This Shit Is Dope. That was a great post. I loved it. Heading back to Sayaka's character design, I would also like to point out her bare shoulders and bare midriff with the jewelry of her soul gem being in her belly button. Of course, she's a character for whom people's perceptions of her and her appearance are important. She wants to be wanted by another person. It's this real West Side Story Maria vibe, right? Add in the fact that nobody in the show, while they call Hitomi and Homura pretty, nobody calls Sayaka pretty. And in a a lot of ways, I do think her personality is kind of compensating for it. Another aspect of her character design that I absolutely love is she has the anime bullshit circles on her, magic, but that they're all staves of, writing music. And they appear every time she's wounded, so it kind of gives the feeling that the music is healing her. And of course, the hairpin fortissimo, very loud. I also just really, really love later in the series, or episode 12 and after, every representation of Sayaka, especially in Rebellion, is so cool because all these elements of her character design are fulfilled, or they're incorporated into who she is in whole, or she's made them her identity, and it feels really cool to see them more manifested, or when she's more confident about it. I think her transformation sequence in Rebellion is probably my favorite, or one of my favorite magical girl transformation sequences ever. And the thought that she becomes a fully realized magical girl with her own identity and symbols and everything is very interesting for talking about the water symbology that's associated with Sayaka. Of course, it's a definite callback to your whatever, blue pretty cures and Sailor Neptune and whatever you want to do. But I think originally the water symbol is kind of hard to take for Sayaka. Aside from things like the tears and crying, aside from the idea that water is healing in some way, I think Sayaka as a personality is very stubborn and very hard-headed. She doesn't have a very go-with-the-flow personality. However, once she accepts everything in episode 12, once she realizes what she's done and make that part of herself and really come to peace with it, she becomes a character who kind of earns that water symbol in the way of a Sailor Neptune or something. And perhaps if she was more willing to go with the flow, to listen and surrender and change, then things might have come out differently for her. It also leads very nicely into talking about the symbology of Octavia von Seckendorf. Of course, we actually see Octavia in the show itself, so we should probably wait until episode 9 to talk more about everything that we see on screen. Let's simply acknowledge for now that she's a mermaid. That concept of, kind of the mermaid or the siren trying to lead Kyosuke in one way, right? You also, of course, have the references to the original tale of the Little Mermaid, which if you're not familiar with the non-Disney version, was a very unhappy ending, punishing the mermaid for her hubris and wanting to have this special love that's far above herself, and attempting to do so through magic. The show also brings up a number of times the direct comparison between Kyoko and Sayaka in regards to a mermaid and a unicorn. Now, that's no illusion, that's kind of the show building its own symbols. There's no external thing that's referencing. But some of the ideas that have been raised, and there's a lot of info on the wiki regarding everything involving the pair and all the symbols that are shown over the course of the extended universe. And an idea that I very much like is that the unicorn is known for having the ability to purify water with its horn. And I think it's really great that Kyoko's witch form, which is only ever seen in the PSP game and some extended media, is riding a horse. It's also named Ophelia, referencing the character in Hamlet who drowns and kind of goes crazy after her father's death. While we're on the topic, Octavia, obviously Octave, von Seckendorf, has two meanings. It can either be knight from history or Carl Sagan von Seckendorf, who was a contemporary of Goethe and related to Goethe in a lot of ways, but never achieved the fame, kind of living in Goethe's shadows. And apparently, from what we know, Goethe didn't think very highly of von Seckendorf. If we have Goethe representing Faust and Faust already tied into this story, that's a pretty deep cut and a really interesting reference on the name there. I mean, we already see the character most associated with Faust, Homura, not respect Sayaka too much. So now getting more into talking about Kyoko, we've already established her kind of animalistic instincts, her need to be consuming food in this way of filling her basest desires. I particularly love the way her dress parts in a way to mirror her spear. And the other thought I immediately have is that how much of her design matches that of Sayaka's. The boots, the leggings are exactly the same. It's got the same kind of, skirt on there. We had a comment a couple couple episodes ago that they really are designed as part of a set, and I think nowhere is that more obvious than in Kyoko and Sayaka. There is one bit of extended lore that I kind of want to bring into when I'm talking about Kyoko and her design and everything. While we see Mami's ribbons, we see Homura's time stopping, and we see Sayaka's healing, we never see Kyoko actually have any type of magic or cast any type of magic. She really only fights with her spear and creates barriers. And that is explicitly deliberate, which is really, really cool and shows a level of foresight that I was just astonished by when I read it. That due to Kyoko's wish, she did have the power to create illusions, and she still does. She just refuses to use that power. Kyubei kind of explains it in a different story as Kyoko rejecting her wish. And yeah, that's when we see her talk about her family, it's very clear that she's moved on from that. She's left that behind. And because of that, she leaves behind the effects of that as well. This speaks a little bit to what we were talking about earlier in regards to the nebulous nature between the actual magic system of the show and what is going on with the characters in the show. Much like the grief seed's redemptive purposes, this is kept deliberately obtuse and confusing and obscure. One, because it's not needed for the show. Two, because the show deliberately needs to put in this level of distance between the actual hard crunch related to like power level scanning and the actual what matters of the show, which is the characters' motivations and willpower and thoughts and values and them capitalizing on that and believing in that. I think we can definitely leave it there. It's just another example of how brilliant the show is and how forward thinking and planning will entirely create your world if you do it right. I don't really have too much to say about Kyoko Sakura. Aside from her last name is Sakura, and that may be a reference obviously to Cardcaptor Sakura. I definitely encourage you to read up on the wiki for all these characters, really, because there's a lot of stuff here. It's sort of like the connection between Kyoko's parsing of her spear, the separate pieces looking like a scorpion's tail. Something really cool that I wouldn't necessarily think about, but it's pretty neat. Yeah, the only other thing I'd say is that I once found a Kyoko Sakura Nendo in Tokyo, in Akihabara, for $10 because it was already opened, but it was all there. So I was like, this is the best deal I've ever found. All right, moving on. So this fight scene is wonderful. I have a lot of different things to say here, I think. First, we're shown of the familiar, which was introduced earlier in the show, and a familiar operating separate from a witch. This function is necessary for the plot, because otherwise it would be very easy just to farm magical girls into witches and get that energy and just sacrifice the lives of the magical girls themselves. To have Sayaka's prerogative of saving others, there needs to be some threat to the outside world. How that happens, like can a witch from a familiar be without a magical girl background or anything like that, doesn't matter at all. It's necessary to set up the ideological conflict, and that's all it needs to do. The familiar here is very cute and non-threatening though, so it's a pretty good example to start off with. We really feel like Sayaka could have taken this out pretty easily, primarily because its design is a child scribbling on a wall. Our introduction to Kyoko's transformed state is her spear coming in and bending with no regard to any type of physics. I mean, that's not super surprising. Sayaka just threw a bunch of swords, but it is a good contrast for the ideology of what's about to happen. Now, we've had so much movement of a character in the screen. We finally have something that is, something since like episode 1 that is a character actively moving in a direction on the screen. Sayaka, running after the witch, moves across the screen to the left. Also very much mirroring the start of episode 4 when she did the exact same thing. And throughout this whole fight, Kyoko is positioned to the left, blocking Sayaka's progress. And progress is very metaphorical again. Moving across the screen to the left is a huge indicator of pushing forward to the unknown or the new. That's fair because this is the first time we see Sayaka acting on her new philosophy. And the way Kyoko stops her is very, very important here, with literally a spear point to her neck. And her words are just as abrupt. Are you blind or something? This goes back to what we were talking about earlier with Kyoko and the way she speaks. When she talks about eating in the food chain, she uses the Japanese verb ku, which again is much more animalistic or crude way of saying to eat. And I think it comes through in the English very well. And the symbol shown on screen is her chomping down on the taiyaki. And then the third kind of really offensive thing that she does is invade Sayaka's personal space by walking straight into it. These three things put together really show her as aggressive, but I think she's talking as she would to a child. She's helping even if it doesn't seem like it. These bellicose actions show her as unwilling to compromise. And I think the shot that best portrays that is when she slams her spear point down into the ground. And her next line is of, "Don't tell me you actually believe in all that." Kyoko here is an agent that is far too direct, just like Homura in that way. With our wider knowledge of the franchise and the show, we can know that Kyoko is this way because of things that have happened to her, much like Homura. That she was never afforded the ability to believe in these traditional magical girl values because of her circumstances. She has a ton of experience knowing that this is the way to live. Sayaka's support of Mami's values are rather flimsy still, or rather nascent. So Kyoko truly believes in what she says more than Sayaka does in the scene, and thereby she gets destroyed. Now here's the crazy thing, is that we would expect some sort of third path here. We would expect there to be a way to talk this out and kind of reconcile these two things. In that way, it's almost the exact same scene that we saw with Homura and Mami. I don't know what it is. It would require a level-headedness, a willingness to engage the other person on where they are, etc., etc. But if you look at something like a Sailor Mars sacrificing for Cone in Sailor Moon R, or any other redemptive magical girl arc, you'll see that the way the characters are thinking about the problems changes and evolves, and then it opens up new possibilities for them. I wrote once that nothing in the genre is ever black and white, only shades of gray. Unfortunately, this is a timeline where that's not allowed to happen. Mami's dead and Madoka is limited directly by Homura's influence. Not that Mami was that great of a mediator anyway, but so nobody really has a desire to work together and have set up this narrow reading that they're going to very binarily live or die by. And the cool thing about this scene is it's very much mirrored by the shot composition. This back alleyway only has two paths, right? Forward and backward. Right or wrong, Sayaka or Kyoko. It's a stark contrast to the wide open possibility we saw in the sky on the riverbank earlier in the episode, or the roof of the various buildings we've been on. We also have all the entwining pipes here that, one, don't make any sense and show this as, you know, a fabrication of a back alley or a mimicry of a back alley, or transient enough that we're not supposed to identify this as a sense of place. All stuff that we established in the first episode. But it's also complicating. If the metaphor is this alley is the path the magical girls must walk, then the different lines distracting them all over the place, not adding up to anything, makes it seem difficult to do. This is all complicated by the fact that Homura completely resets everything when she comes in. It's constantly shifting. It's a story about people who are lost, and pipes like this are a great way of showing it. Furthermore, and it's no secret that my opinions on Rebellion are generally negative, but we have something here that is set up and called back to in Rebellion in the most beautiful way. Here we see the pipe breaking after Kyoko's first attack, the water spilling everywhere like blood or tears, bits of Sayaka's willpower, bits of her life as a magical girl flowing out, having to fight this person she doesn't have to. So when Sayaka meets Homura in the back alley in Rebellion, when we see Octavia reflected in the puddle, when Sayaka's will has been filled and now she's taking advantage of that spilled water, of her owning it, that's a symbol fulfilled. Or even think about when Kyoko cuts open Octavia and the blood of the two mixes together. A lot of the symbols are actually the wounds bleeding from Sayaka. The bloody tears when she fights Elsa Maria. Her will and her life force and everything that she is gushing out and draining from her is kind of what happens to Sayaka. Switching gears, I'm not too much of a fan of action choreography. And we've already established that Kyoko is the more resolute one, so that's why she's winning this fight. But some other stuff I want to point out. A lot of the really sketchy and lame animation that pops up throughout Madoka Magica, especially in the original TV airing, well, I think a lot of that can be forgiven if you hit a couple really good moments, and this fight has one of them. The only cut I ever remember from this fight is Kyoko with the spear disassembled looking down with her face all in black and the red eye. Even though the number of sketchy animation cuts far outweigh it, I personally don't remember anything other than the time they stuck the landing with that one shot. Also, think about this. Sayaka's stubbornness is what causes Kyoko to respect her, and the parallels in their story is going to become really clear if it isn't already. In this way, Sayaka being dumb and stubborn and taking this fight changes Kyoko. So even though Sayaka eventually abandons this wish or these values, she has, by dint of the struggle with Kyoko, nonetheless rekindled those values in her. And doesn't that single thing mirror Homura more than anything else? That though their struggle seems ultimately fruitless for them and their objectives, still the struggle has been given meaning by how they have influenced their world and the people around them. And isn't that the truest thing and really the ultimate point of Madoka Magica? That these values can't be repressed. They can't be abandoned or forgotten or invalidated. That on a long enough timeline or a long enough perspective, hope and love and compassion will sneak back and reclaim their power and affect people positively. That through all the gloom, there is an undertone of the undeniability of compassion and faith and love. From here on out, the magical girl's story is only going to get worse, and Sayaka's play that we're watching is only going to expose her folly and the follies of the values she believes in. But that's only on the surface. And always, throughout everything, that sprig of hope is going to be pushing its way up through the concrete until it finally blooms. Once again, I appreciate you all listening through all of this. There was a bit too much to talk about in this episode, and it was honestly the first one where I've had to make some severe cuts on stuff that just wasn't that interesting. Join us next time, and we'll talk a little bit about the part that really confused me the most when I was watching this show through, and get to our really juicy and really awesome Madoka drinking with her mom scene. Look forward to it.